Mr Acting Deputy President.
Thank you. Senator Ludlam.
Thanks, Mr Acting Deputy President. I just want to add some brief comments and are well aware that time is fairly short, in addition to those put on the record by my colleague Senator Hanson-Young, because as she spoke of the penalties introduced in this bill for speaking out about some of the horrors that occur in our immigration detention centres, she spoke of 2-year jail sentences, jail terms, for disclosing some of the human rights abuses that are being perpetrated in our name. And of course the question that occurs to me is, well, how would they track down who is talking to journalists? And it's extraordinary to discover that 6 weeks after this parliament debated mandatory data retention legislation that basically scoops up all of the material generated by any device connected to the internet, telecommunications devices, for every Australian, whether they're assumed to be doing anything wrong or not. And Senator Brandis made a great show of narrowing the range of agencies that mandatory data retention, the range of agencies that would be able to access this material collected. And here we are, back in Parliament, on the very next sitting week after that mandatory data retention bill passed, and the first example of scope creep lies on the table today, because of course the Australian Border Force wants to be able to scrape people's phone and email records and find out who they've been talking to and where they were. So this is the first instance of scope creep. It gives me absolutely no pleasure to say we told you so, but we did at the time of the data retention debate that bill has scope creep written into it. There's another kink though, because the normal way in which a range of agencies would be expanded who would be able to access this material would be that it can be declared by the Attorney-General, and then a new agency is then able to collect that material. But of course it has to be subject to eventual approval by the PJCIS, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and then this parliament. But of course something very different is happening here. The Border Force legislation that's before us today sidesteps even this feeble check and balance by simply amending the Telecommunications Interception and Access Act to change the classification of the Border Force agency to allow it to access extra classes of telecommunications data. That's just done but the turn of a switch. We'll call them a criminal law enforcement agency, and now they are added to the list of agencies that can go through our phone and email records. Not just employees, not just that of asylum seekers, but anybody in the country. It's absolutely remarkable, and it is precisely what we said would happen when the Labor Party, that's just in the process of waving this bill through as non-controversial, also rubber-stamped the government's controversial data retention legislation. We are going to need to keep a very careful look at any material of machinery of government change that adds or subtracts or merges or demerges government departments to see if these kind of riders are going to be contained. The Border Force's access to private information is particularly troubling, given its history, its terrible history of securing its own data. The Senator will recall that the Immigration Department last year accidentally disclosed the personal details of nearly 10,000 asylum seekers in one of the largest data breaches in Australian history. It attracted more than 1,600 complaints. And these are people for whom the release of their names, their locations, where they've been and other personal records could be a matter of life and death. Senator Hanson-Young has explained in detail persistently over a matter of years, these are people fleeing, in some cases, murderous regimes. You say, oh, if they've got nothing to hide, they've got nothing to fear. People have things to fear from the Iranian secret police or the Sri Lankan government or the Taliban. People do have things to fear, and that is why that data breach was such a disgrace. And now the successor agency to the one that let that material walk out the door and remain on a published website for days is asking to be able to access all of Australians' private records as well. There are also moves which, again, Senator Hanson-Young has outlined at length by the government to refer leaks involving asylum seekers to the Australian Federal Police for investigation. When you hear evidence of sexual abuse, when you hear evidence of violence inside our detention camps, do you move in there to try and sort things out or to get people out of these places of horror? No, you don't. You refer the journalists who wrote the reports to the Federal Police to try and find out who they've been talking to. How will the Federal Police find out? How will Border Force find out? They will be vacuuming up people's data, people who have not committed any crimes, people who are trying to disclose crimes. And that is why the debate around immigration detention has become so corrupt. But for anybody who was wondering just how dangerous these powers of telecommunications access can be. Here is an example sitting on the table before us today. It is entirely plausible to imagine the Border Force tracking down sources through their contacts with journalists and attempting to prosecute them for leaking information about asylum seeker issues to journalists. They will have access, and anybody who's contemplating employment in this agency needs to be aware of this, to the personal private records of every one of their employees, their families, everyone they come into contact with, everyone they talk to, whether they're assumed of committing a crime or not. They can access that material by rubber stamping a single piece of A4 paper and submitting it to the telecommunications provider. No warrants needing to be entered into. That bill had scope creep written into it. It's extremely distressing to discover, particularly with an agency with the task before the Australian Border Force, that even the narrow checks and balances that were incorporated into the data retention bill are entirely circumvented by the legislation we see before us today. I'm going to make an absolute point of every time another agency sticks its hand up, either overtly or covertly, to be able to access the private records of ordinary people, to point it out, to put it on the record, so that maybe either the government, once they're safely back in opposition, or the Australian Labor Party might want to rethink what they did to all Australian citizens when they waved through data retention legislation upon all of us.